Hey, my name's John Dorney, and I'm happy to be here in Swords speaking about Dublin in the Irish War of Independence, 1917 to 1921. Now, we talk about this as a war. In most ways, it's really a political conflict with a violent angle. Dublin was described by the IRA as vital for prestige reasons. So Richard Mulcahy, the Chief of Staff of the IRA, talks about how no victories in other provinces are going to be important if we can't hold Dublin. But what this means is, as long as we show that there's an IRA presence in Dublin, that we do attacks on British forces in Dublin, it shows that British rule is being opposed. So it's kind of a propaganda war. But the guerrilla campaign in Dublin was late to start, and it was never as intense as either the Rising of 1916 or the IRA campaign in Munster from 1919 to 21. The British military had a very large garrison, as we'll see in Dublin, of both police and military. They failed to suppress the IRA. Now, what they justified this failure as was divided command. So the police and the military had two separate commands, a muddled intelligence system. Again, as we'll see, intelligence was handed over from the military to the police halfway through, and a lack of political will. So soldiers probably always blame their defeats on the politicians who didn't have the will for victory, who didn't understand military matters. And this is certainly the case in Dublin in this period. But while, as I said, in a way, it's a propaganda war, it's a war for publicity, people are very aware that it's also a shooting war. And civilians are often caught in the crossfire of political violence in Dublin, be they targeted by one side or the other, which they are, be they going about their business and falling victims to street ambushes, to bombs and to bullets. So even though, in a sense, it's a propaganda war, the victims of it are very real. The prelude to the War of Independence in Dublin is obviously the Easter Rising. Now, what we see here in the first picture, the picture on the left, is prisoners being marched away after the Easter Rising. Famously, part of the story of the Rising is that many of the prisoners were jeered by Dubliners on their way to captivity. I don't believe that's the whole story, actually, but it certainly happened. The Rising was not a popular event at the time. But what we see in the other picture, the picture on the right, is prisoners returning from captivity only the following year. So British policy after the Rising went from long terms of penal servitude, and obviously executions, to freeing the prisoners, most of them after only 6 months. And the really remarkable thing is that what we see them here is coming back to Pearse Street Station, Westland Row Station, as it's known at the time, and they're mobbed by adoring crowds. So there's a real change in public opinion has already taken place, partly as a result of the executions of the leaders, which was viewed to be unjust. Partly it's a result of the First World War going on. People are afraid of conscription, of going and dying in the First World War. And partly it's a result of Home Rule, the self-government of Ireland, which was promised in 1914, never having been delivered. So for all of these reasons, which are really too complex to go into now, there's a real change in public opinion. And what we're going to see in the War of Independence in Dublin in 1919 to 21 is not this spontaneous insurrection or surprise insurrection of 1916, but much more of a political military effort with a lot more popular support. The Dublin Brigade of the IRA is the ones who'll do the fighting in Dublin. The picture here is actually of just before the Civil War period, after the period we're going to be talking about, but it's one of the only pictures of armed IRA volunteers in the period. These guys are on Grafton Street. The Dublin Brigade had 4 city battalions. It had 5th, the Engineers, and 6th Battalion in South County Dublin. There was also a Fingal Brigade in this part of the world. The nominal rolls of the brigade tell us that there was 5,500 men. Now, there wasn't anywhere near that number of active men. The number of men who were active at all is probably about 2,000, including people who were imprisoned at various times. And the people who carried arms, who actually fought in the War of Independence, is probably no larger than 300 in Dublin at any one time. There's an interesting kind of class basis to the IRA in Dublin. The officers, the heads of the battalions, are generally of the lower middle class. Joe O'Connor, for example, who is the head of 3rd Battalion, which is in the south inner city, is a rates collector. Frank Henderson, who by the end of this period is the head of 2nd Brigade, 2nd Battalion rather, which is on the north side, is a clerk. And this is typical of kind of IRA officers. Of the rank and file, what you find is they're from the skilled working class. They're artisans, they're house painters, they're carpenters. They're the skilled trades of the Dublin working class. What you don't generally find in the Dublin IRA is the very poor. The unskilled are underrepresented, the people who lived in the slums, who worked from casual labour. About 30% of the IRA volunteers in Dublin are not from the city. They're like many people who come to live in Dublin before and since from outside of the city, from the rest of Ireland. This is judged by Casualties. And another thing that we find quite commonly is university students. So famously, Kevin Barry, who's executed in November 1920, is a UCD student. But it's not uncommon. They're overrepresented for their share of the population, which was very small at the time, the number of students in third level. This is Dublin in 1920. As we can see, it's a lot smaller than the city today. It's basically still mostly between the two canals. The 4 Dublin battalions, which we'll mostly be talking about, are very roughly in the top left of our picture. The purple and red is 1 battalion. On the north side, in the green, yellow and pink is 2 battalion. 3 battalion is just on the other side of the river in the south docks, the south inner city, and 4 battalion is the bottom left quadrant here, and it also is the southern suburbs. Now, as I said, while the War of Independence really has its most intense area in Munster, in Dublin for the first 2 years, really 1919 to 1920, it's mostly limited to these guys here. These are members of the squad and the intelligence department. So what this is basically, in a sense, the personal army of Michael Collins, who was the director of IRA intelligence. Michael Collins has become such a legendary figure. People think he was the general of the IRA, which is a rank that doesn't exist. He's the head of everything, but his job in the IRA was the head of intelligence. The squad's job was essentially to kill people who Michael Collins thought were interfering or were putting down the Republican movement. Now, the political context is, of course, Sinn Féin won the 1918 election. They declared Irish independence. They also won the local elections in early 1920. And in early 1920, late 1919, the Dáil is suppressed by the British. Sinn Féin and the volunteers are declared illegal organisations. And for my money, this is when the war really kicks off. So what Collins does here is, at first, he wants to target the detectives who are pointing out people for arrest. There's a wide sweep of arrests of both civilian and military activists. And what the squad is set up to do in late 1919 is to counteract this. The intelligence department was run by Liam Tobin, who was a man originally from Cork but living in Philipsburgh. The men were selected mostly from 2nd Battalion, which was headed by Dick McKee, who later became the commander of the Dublin Brigade. And there's about 21 members by the time of the truce. Originally there's 12, hence the nickname the 12 Apostles, but there's 21 members according to the pension statements. And they carried out at least 25 assassinations in the city. It's quite a ruthless use of force, but it's very targeted. Now, most of their victims are detectives of the Dublin Metropolitan Police. Later on, they're British military agents. And there's 1 or 2 civilians who they kill as well. Like, for example, Alan Bell, who is investigating the Dáil loan. He's an accountant who's trying to seize the Dáil's finances. Frank Brooke, for example, who advises the British military on railway. He's assassinated. But this kind of up-close personal killing, it's done at close range with handguns. It took its toll on these men. So much later in 1924, when there's an army inquiry, and they look back at many of the things that were done, these men, the men of the squad and the intelligence department, are described as the shock troops of the IRA, but it's also stated by a man named Charles Russell that if there was shell shock in the IRA, it existed among these men. And the killing that they were asked to do, that they had to do, left them anything but normal, is what Charles Russell said. But apart from the squad, the Dublin Brigade, which was quite large, and which had been reorganised after the Rising, as I said, when the prisoners were released, did relatively little, really, up until very late 1920. So there were many arms raids. They would seize weapons off British troops. They would often buy weapons off British soldiers who were happy to sell them to them. They would steal weapons from barracks. For example, Wellington Barracks, today Griffith College, on the South Circular Road. One soldier cooperated with them, with Joe O'Connor and 3rd Battalion, to steal a whole host of weapons out of the barracks. There's a train hijacked, for example, on Sheriff Street. There's gelignite explosives seized. The North King Street raid, which was a raid on British soldiers delivering bread, where Kevin Barry was captured and 2 soldiers were killed, was actually a raid for arms. So it wasn't an attempt actually to kill the troops involved. But this all really changed from the IRA's perspective on Bloody Sunday, 21st of November 1920. So this, unlike what had gone on before in Dublin, where you had targeted killings of detectives, of officials, where you had raids for arms, but very few kind of wholesale attacks on British forces. Bloody Sunday which was the brainchild of Michael Collins, the head of intelligence, but was actually organised by Sean Russell, who was the head of 2nd Battalion at the time. It involved about 200 men. It involved the squad, but far more men than that. And they were supposed to kill about 35 British officers in Dublin as they slept in the early morning of November 21st. In the end, they killed 14, including one auxiliary who happened on the scene. But it was a ruthless attempt to try to wipe out British intelligence. Now, I'm going to go on to British forces and their kind of side of things in a second. What Collins views this as is the British upped the ante by introducing new forces into Ireland in the summer of 1920, the Black and Tans and Auxiliaries, also far more British intelligence. They stepped up arrests, also killings of volunteers. So Bloody Sunday is seen by Collins as a counterstroke, but it's a bloody action. From the point of view of the IRA and the Dublin Brigade, one of the major fallouts from Bloody Sunday, now we're going to talk about the British military and their response to it, but one of the fallouts from the IRA is Dick McKee, who was the head of the brigade, was captured just before Bloody Sunday, the night before, along with Pater Clancy and a civilian friend of theirs, and they were murdered in Dublin Castle. So the man who did more to reorganise the Dublin Brigade since the rising, Dick McKee, was a victim of Bloody Sunday as well. He was succeeded by Oscar Traynor. And it's only after this point, really, that you see guerrilla war developing in Dublin. So the active service units are formed. The active service units are full-time volunteers. So they're paid, they have nothing to do but fight, they carry arms all the time. And there's about 100 men who are divided into 4 units, each of the city's 4 battalions. The first ambush at Drumcondra in early 1920 was a bit of a disaster. So 6 men were captured and they were later executed. They were later hung in Mountjoy. But the brigade companies were also encouraged to go on patrol. So what this means is, if you were a member of a company in Dublin, so each battalion has about 6 companies, you would meet up in a safe house, you would collect weapons, you would walk the streets of your local area, and you would look for British forces, either police or military, and you would attempt to attack them. You would attempt to fire a few shots, maybe throw an improvised grenade. There was a number of explosive factories around the city, and try to get away. So this is an attempt to escalate the War of Independence in Dublin, and it's really, again, about kind of armed propaganda. You have to show that the IRA is active in Dublin, that they're really resisting the British presence. What we see here is British soldiers on the streets. I think this is the Camden Street, Angier Street area, which was nicknamed the Dardanelles after the Gallipoli campaign. Such was the frequency of ambushes. But they're small in scale. They don't compare to the kind of the sustained fighting of the Rising. Only about 10% of the brigade had access to rifles, and many of the rifles of the brigade were actually sent to rural areas where they were easier to use. 25% to handguns, and 30% had access to grenades. These are British figures. Now, what a guerrilla needs in Dublin is not so much rifles and machine guns as handguns and grenades. Why? Because they can be easily hidden. You can fire a few shots, throw a grenade, put the bomb, or, well, not the bomb after you use it, but put the gun back into your coat and get away, and then you can just appear to be a normal civilian. And this is the typical kind of IRA action in Dublin. Richard Mulcahy, who was the IRA Chief of Staff, and man who's often written out too much of accounts of the War of Independence in favour of Michael Collins, his more famous colleague. Richard Mulcahy is the Chief of Staff, he's the head of the IRA. And what he says to a memo in March of 1921 to actually all IRA units is, the grip of our forces in Dublin must be maintained at all costs. No victories in distant provincial areas have any value if Dublin is lost. And for example, the IRA in Cork was far from impressed with this. They figured they'd been doing the hard fighting. But Mulcahy said, our troops are pinning 1/6 of English armed forces without too much effort, he went on to say, in Dublin. Most attacks are being done by battalions 2 and 3. So the most active battalions are 2, which is in the northeast of the city, and 3, which is in the southeast. 1 and 4 are being worked up. So it's a bit of a rebuke, actually, to 1 and 4 battalions. So Mulcahy advised cutting transport, sniping, and an anti-tout offensive. What this means is he wants them to kill informers, people who are talking to the police, and to rely on handguns more than grenades in ambushes. So, if that's the IRA perspective, it starts off slowly with a few assassinations. It escalates over November, December 1920 with the IRA forming full-time units and stepping up kind of guerrilla attacks in Dublin. What's the point of view of the British forces, the Crown forces? Well, the first one is not British at all. It's an indigenous police force, the Dublin Metropolitan Police. Now, that was an unarmed force, but they had a detective division which was very active, which was armed, which had the job of pointing out separatist activists. They had always had this job. The G Division, the Special Branch particularly. Now, 12 of them were killed by the squad, the detectives, and the DMP as a whole. There was an attempt by the British government to arm them, but the DMP basically stepped out of the fight in October 1920. They said they didn't want to carry arms. There was a secret deal brokered by Jeremiah Mee, who was a deserter from the RIC, from the Royal Irish Constabulary, between him and Michael Collins, and the DMP stepped out of the fight in October 1920. They said they didn't want to carry weapons, they didn't want to go on military patrol, and the IRA in return agreed not to target them. So what were the Crown forces left with? Well, they had a very substantial military garrison in Dublin, 7,700 men. It would have been large anyway, even in peacetime, but it's a militarised garrison in this period. They're wearing the steel helmets of war, they're going around with bayonets fixed in armoured vehicles. Possibly more important are the police. There's 1,200 Royal Irish Constabulary, and this includes the new recruits, the Black and Tans, who I'll get onto in a second. Contrary to popular opinion, they're not different forces, they're the same people. They're mostly based in the depot in the Phoenix Park. And there's the Auxiliaries. Now, the Auxiliaries, unlike the Black and Tans, are really a feared counterinsurgency corps. Like, the Black and Tans have the worst reputation. These are the British kind of wartime recruits to the RIC. Many of the Black and Tans, you find, are not that invested in the struggle. But the Auxiliaries are former officers. They're paid higher. They're better armed. They're in their own companies. There's 4 of them in Dublin, 1 in Dublin Castle, 2 in Beggars Bush, 1 down the docks, about 250 men. With their distinctive uniform, their beret, their trench coats, and they fly around the city in motorised vehicles with machine guns, with shotguns, with rifles, with handguns. And they're noted by people as being a particularly brutal force, in Dublin as elsewhere actually. And finally, there's the IGO gang. Now, the IGO gang are Irish RIC officers in plainclothes under Eugene Igo, who's a man from the west of Ireland. And they're brought in to take over the job, if possible, that the DMP abandoned, which was to try to identify IRA members and IRA activists in the street. And while they don't actually have great success in kind of tracking down the squad in the intelligence department, there's a few very narrow shaves. But the British military command complained throughout that they weren't given a free hand in trying to put down what they called the Irish Rebellion in Dublin. So the military commander in Dublin is a man by the name of General Gerald Boyd. Like many British military figures, he'd served throughout the British Empire in the Boer War, in the First World War. And his head of intelligence, John Brind, felt they were hampered by the government's half measures. Now, in their report, the main thing that they cite here, the first thing that they cite, is early 1920. The military arrested under wartime legislation, the Defence of the Realm Act, they arrested hundreds of activists in Dublin and put them in Mountjoy. But when the prisoners went on hunger strike in March of 1920, the British government let them go. They were afraid of creating more martyrs after Thomas Ashe, who died on hunger strike in 1917, and they let them go. Now, the military viewed this as kind of criminal weakness. Martial law was never declared in Dublin, as it was in the south, and this meant the people who were arrested had to be tried by court-martial. So there was still military rule in that sense that they weren't tried by civilian courts, but it meant that instead of just sticking people in an internment camp, which you could do elsewhere in the country, a large part of military effort and paperwork had to be gone into trying each one of them by court-martial. And finally, one thing that really enraged the military was that intelligence was taken out of the army's hands altogether in late 1920 and given to Ormond Winter. Now, Ormond Winter was a military officer, but he was seconded to the police, to the Royal Irish Constabulary. And under Henry Hugh Tudor, who was the new chief of police, who devised the Black and Tans and the Auxiliaries, he was given control of intelligence in Dublin. All the intelligence that they had established up until then, who was in the IRA, where their arms were and so on, was handed over to Winter. So what the military viewed this as is really a false start, where everything had to be started from scratch. They had generally a lack of reliable informants. There was a couple of attempts to infiltrate the IRA. They were generally unsuccessful. Most of them were identified and they were shot. They had more success in kind of interrogating people. They were often very brutal interrogations involving beatings and so on. Ernie O'Malley, for example, who was captured and interrogated by Auxiliaries in Dublin Castle, was threatened with a red-hot poker and he was beaten and so on. And gradually they did begin to build up a picture. These are some of the pictures of the Auxiliaries and Tans. These are Auxiliaries in Dublin, and you see the distinctive uniform, the beret, the trench coat, the shotgun, as opposed to the regular rifle. There's very interesting kind of oral accounts from Dublin from this period. Of people who lived in the Dublin tenements at the time. And what they say is the average British soldier, regular British soldier, the Tommy, was fine. He said they were the sons of good English people, they would say. You could talk to them. But the Tans and the Auxiliaries, and generally when people talked about the Black and Tans, I'm pretty sure they meant the Auxiliaries, they said that they were criminals, they were gangsters, they were ruffians, they were released from prison to come to Ireland. Now we know that this is not true actually, because you weren't accepted into the RIC if you did have a criminal record, but their behaviour in Ireland and in Dublin motivated people to think that this is what they were. They were people who were let out of prison. Such was their bad behaviour. I mean, they would often break into people's houses, and while searching them, they would smash all the furniture, they would steal anything of value. They generally behaved very badly. They alienated the civilian population from British tactics. So we've talked about the IRA from really late 1920 launches this kind of guerrilla campaign in Dublin where they're attacking British troops in the street, they're throwing bombs at them, they're firing shots. When we talk about British tactics, there's kind of two elements to it. The first one is what military call force protection. So what are they doing to stop getting killed? One of them is the use of hostages to deter ambushes. So they would get prominent Sinn Féin politicians as hostages and they would tie them to their lorries and they would drive around so that people would be afraid to shoot or bomb them. This was eventually discontinued because it created a very bad political impression. The other thing they did in terms of force protection was parallel patrols. So if you had a patrol going down one street, you had to have a patrol going down the next street. This meant people couldn't creep up from the side streets. There was a curfew every night. By the end of the War of Independence, there was a curfew from I think 8 in the evening to 8 in the morning. And if you were outside after curfew, you were liable to arrest. And after I think February 1921, if you were found on the street after curfew, you were liable to be shot, and quite a few civilians were shot just because they were out after curfew hours. There was massive house searches in January and February 1921. In January 1921, the area around Mountjoy Square, which was very densely populated at the time, it still is today, but much more so back then, was sealed off for 2 or 3 days, and it was searched by troops with battering rams and tanks. And the same for the area around the forecourts, which again is very densely populated. But the results were really very meagre. They captured 1 or 2 arms, but nothing of any major value. And what the British military report says is Dublin is honeycombed with cellars and with secret tunnels. And even if you seal off an area, you really can't find all the people inside. The other thing that British forces start to do is, of course, they start to retaliate. So Bloody Sunday, which I've mentioned from the IRA perspective, is the most famous example. So on Bloody Sunday morning, 14 British officers were assassinated. So a mixed force of military and police drove to Croke Park, where there was a football match between Dublin and Tipperary that afternoon. And it's very confused what exactly happened. The military maintained they never fired any shots. Crozier, who was the head of the Auxiliaries, maintained his men didn't fire, and he blamed the new Black and Tan recruits who arrived from the Phoenix Park from the depot and said that they opened fire without any justification whatsoever. But 14 civilians were shot dead in Croke Park, which is the most famous reprisal. Here in Fingal, another famous reprisal in September 1920 was obviously the sack of Balbriggan. But in Dublin City, there was less burning, let's say, and more killing. And in 1921, it became very common for IRA men to be shot and killed after they were arrested. So there was a case in Drumcondra in February 1921 where 2 IRA men were shot after arrest. Now actually the Auxiliaries concerned were court-martialed, but they were cleared, which was kind of typical of the climate. There's 54 IRA members killed in Dublin in this period. Only 16 of them are killed in action, listed as that in the IRA records, which is to say most of them were shot after arrest, or they were killed while prisoners or assassinated. There was also a couple killed in accidents as well, but the most common way where IRA members were killed was they were simply shot after arrest by British forces. And a number were also executed. The executions began in November 1920 with Kevin Barry, the 18-year-old student, was caught after the raid after North King Street, and he was hung despite a great public outcry. We see in this picture is one of these search operations I talked about. This is a British tank, which was recently developed in the First World War. And what it's being used for there is to batter down a door. And we see serried ranks really of helmeted troops. So even though, as I said, that the combat is on a small scale, Dublin still looks like a war zone throughout this period. So the height of the guerrilla war in Dublin, urban guerrilla warfare, is 1921. So really from January to July 1921. So from this IRA escalation when they formed full-time units up until the Truce, which very suddenly ended the conflict in July 1921. IRA ambushes became very common. There was nearly 1 ambush a day. Civilian casualties were very common. For example, 2 ambushes on Ainger Street in February 1921 killed a 3-year-old boy and the mother of a large family and wounded 5. And this caused some dissension actually within the Republican movement, within the IRA. So Cathal Brugha, who was the Minister for Defence in the Dáil, got on to Collins and Mulcahy, who were the heads of the IRA basically, and of the the heads of the Dublin Brigade, which was Oscar Traynor. And he said, why are we doing ambushes on Saturday nights when people are out shopping? So in those days, Saturday was only a half day off. People tried to do their shopping on Saturday evening, and this was the time when the IRA was throwing bombs and so on in the street. So Cathal Brugha tried to get ambushes cancelled on Saturday night, for example, but there was over 240 civilians killed and wounded in Dublin by the truce. Having said that, IRA accounts generally say that civilians were supportive. Now they would say this, of course, but the British reports and the British record of the rebellion in Dublin, as they called it, also backed this up. They said they didn't get much cooperation. What we see here is in the picture is British troops holding back a crowd. IRA accounts said civilians often informed them of ambushes, of British ambushes. They hid guns. For example, the street traders on Wexford Street would hide guns for IRA members when they were trying to get away. There was mass protests and strikes at various points. The hunger strikes of March 1920, when Kevin Barry was executed in November of 1920. And on March 14th, when, as we'll see, 6 IRA men were hung, there was mass protests. There was a general strike in the city on March 14th, 1921. And this does show that the IRA campaign, for all that the toll that it took on the civilian population, did have a considerable amount of popular support. What we see here is outside Mountjoy. The picture is British troops cordoning back a crowd. I mentioned that there was a disastrous kind of IRA ambush when the active service unit was just getting going in January 1921 in Drumcondra, where 6 men were captured. Well, they were executed by hanging on March 14th, 1921. Huge crowds, about 40,000 people gathered outside Mountjoy to protest. A general strike was called in the city in protest by the labour movement, but they were hung in any case. And the Dublin IRA companies were ordered to attack any Crown forces that they could, which led to one of the largest kind of encounters in the city. This is 144 Pearse Street, which today is actually a Dublin City Library, but was the headquarters of an IRA company of 3rd Battalion. And the auxiliaries, either through information from an informant or good luck, raided the premises, and fire was opened on them by the IRA company, which was meeting inside. So there was a hail of fire, which is how the press describes it, from the rooftops and windows, 5 minutes of firing. But it showed why the IRA actions in the city were small scale and why they had to be, because even a 16-man auxiliary patrol with their rifles, with their machine guns and their armoured Crossley tender obviously had the upper hand over very lightly armed IRA members with revolvers and their homemade grenades. So there was 7 dead by the time the firing stopped. 2 IRA, 2 auxiliaries and 3 bystanders, which was one of the largest kind of encounters in Dublin in the period. The other was, of course, the Customs House raid. So as we get towards May 1921, what we start to see is the political conflict. Both sides are attempting to find a way out. Both sides are attempting to find a way towards negotiations. So Andy Cope, who was increasingly prominent, he was a civil servant sent over to try to find solutions in Ireland. Andy Cope was talking behind the scenes with Michael Collins about a truce. There was an occasion, for example, Eamon de Valera arrived back in Ireland in this period and he was arrested by British troops, and Cope told him to let him go because it would damage negotiations. Similarly, the squad started to trail Andy Cope, who, as I said, was a senior British official, with a view to killing him, and Collins told him to stop immediately because Cope is our access to the British government, he's our line of communication. But in this period where both sides are jockeying for position while looking for a way out, Eamon de Valera, who, as I said, arrived back in Ireland, the President of the Republic, wanted a show of strength in Dublin, and what was agreed was that the Customs House, which was the centre of local government, would be burned by the IRA. It involved, we think, over 200 IRA men from all of the city's battalions, and while they burned down the Customs House, over 80 of them were captured and 5 were killed. So again, it's similar to the Pearse Street ambush in the sense that once the IRA are cornered in large numbers, they're really no match for the British forces, just because the British forces are so much more heavily armed and there's so many more of them. So Liz Gillis, for example, argues that it wasn't such a disaster because there were lots more IRA men on the books and so on. But it was a serious reverse in the sense that they lost 85 killed on the day. Tom Ennis, who was the head of the operation, was seriously wounded. Many of the squad men were captured. The squad had to be amalgamated with the active service unit afterwards in something called the Dublin Guard. But the campaign went on. So among the things the IRA continued to do was the Belfast boycott. So this was stopping people from doing business with Belfast. The reason for this was attacks on Catholics in Belfast as punishment. No company in Dublin or the south of Ireland was allowed to do business with Belfast. Ambushes went on. 3 soldiers, for example, were killed on Wexford Street in a grenade attack. And what you start to see also in the spring of 1921 and summer of 1921 is something you don't see before, which is that the IRA starts to kill civilians in Dublin. They didn't kill as many as places like Cork, where there's, I think, 70 or 80 killed in this period, but there's 15 civilians shot as informers, mostly in the spring and summer of 1921. It's not gratuitous, they're not killing people because they had rival political opinions or based on personal grudges. It's because they think they're talking to the authorities at a time when it's increasingly common for IRA members to be arrested, to be executed. But it kind of escalates the brutality of the conflict, that both sides really are targeting civilians by this point. Now, if you read the British military reports, and if you read the British record of the rebellion in Dublin, which has been published actually by William Sheehan, they claim to have the IRA on the ropes by the time the truce intervened on July 11th, 1921. So, as I said, there had been back-channel negotiations throughout the period. By July 1921, suddenly there's an announcement that their hostilities will cease on July 11th, 1921, which will allow negotiations to proceed. And what the British military says is this was a great betrayal because we had the rebels, as I said, on the ropes. Now, I'm not sure this is really the case because the Dublin Brigade, for example, recorded 67 attacks in April of 1921, 103 in May, which is the month of the Customs House raid, and 92 in June. So even though they lost quite a few people in the Customs House raid, the attacks fell only very slightly the following month in June. They were short on ammunition. It was very difficult to import ammunition into Ireland and weapons, and everything they got really was seized from British forces. But they started converting the rifle ammunition to revolver ammunition because, as I said, the IRA in Dublin really only used handguns. They had imported Thompson submachine guns from America, so a new weapon, which was very effective at close range anyway in the streets, and several were used in Dublin in June 1921. The British military was certainly very worried about this. There was a raid on British military transport in June 1921, which destroyed 40 vehicles, including new armoured cars. So, contrary really to the version that the IRA in Dublin was finished after the Customs House, and contrary to what the British military said at the time, I don't think the IRA was finished by the time of the truce. They were certainly under pressure. Over 1,000 of them had been arrested and imprisoned in Dublin, about 50 killed, but they weren't finished by any means. So, by the time of the truce, according to Ewan O'Halpin, who has compiled a study called The Dead of the Irish Revolution, there had been 309 people killed in Dublin between 1919 and 1921, and July 1921. But really, almost all of them were killed between the summer of 1920 and July of 1921. So most of them were killed in a period of about 8 months. 58 IRA killed, 70 wounded, over 1,400 interned. So while it was a dangerous time for Dublin, for IRA men in Dublin, it was much more likely they'd be imprisoned than killed, actually. 33 British Army, although 42 were also killed in firearms or other accidents. So the more British soldiers were killed in Dublin by shooting each other by mistake, by firearms accidents, than were killed by the IRA. 40 police were killed in Dublin by the IRA, 8 DMP, Dublin Metropolitan Police, who were mostly detectives, 11 auxiliaries, and 22 RIC or Black and Tans, which leaves about 150 civilians. So about half of the people who were killed in this period of political violence in Dublin were actually civilians. The truce came for combatants. Now, the people on the political side, this was at the end of a long period of manoeuvring, but for the combatants, the truce came kind of as a bolt from the blue. So suddenly on July 11th, 1921, both sides were told that hostilities were to cease. The press reports say Dublin was calm rather than ecstatic, but people noticed the complete disappearance from the streets of military and police lorries and armoured cars. So for the previous 6 months, really, or nearly a year, Dublin had resembled a war zone. So there'd been armoured vehicles, armed soldiers patrolling up and down the streets, and very suddenly this ceased due to the truce. The IRA established a training camp in the Glenasmole Valley, which is a valley overlooking Tala in the Dublin Mountains. And a British Army report concluded in October 1921, so this is after the truce, the IRA, which was in a desperate situation before the truce with their ASUs, active service units, and columns being chased and harried from pillar to post, defeated and broken up, was now a more formidable organisation. So what the British Army said was, even by their estimation, the IRA was on the run at the time of the truce. This was no longer the case after they had time for a period of reorganisation. So should hostilities have restarted, the British military were worried that the IRA would be a more formidable organisation. Now, of course, this did not happen. This did not happen because what intervened was the Treaty of December 6, 1921, which formally ended the War of Independence in Dublin, but which actually inaugurated another period of conflict, the Civil War. But that's a story for another day. Thank you very much.